want to bring in Lindsay Chervinsky. She's an American presidential historian and executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. Tell us about Jimmy Carter's relationship with subsequent presidents after he served his one term and how he influenced him in his post-presidency.
Jimmy Carter had a very interesting relationship with his predecessors. There is a president's club, and that makes sense because it is a job that few people can possibly understand. The decisions that come to the Oval Office are impossible ones. Otherwise, they get solved long before they reach the president's desk. And yet, if you look at pictures when Carter is standing with the other presidents, he's often a little bit to the side. There's sometimes a gap between him and some of the other members. And I think that speaks volumes. He always felt that he was a bit of an outsider in D.C. He didn't love the D.C. culture. He didn't love working with the other D.C. institutions. And he sometimes really irked his successors in particular because he didn't always keep his opinions to himself, especially when it came to foreign policy. So he certainly was friendly with a bunch of the other presidents, but he wasn't always as close as sometimes we know, for example, Bush and Clinton are, or even at moments Obama and Biden have been. I think perhaps of all the presidents, he probably gets along best with President Biden. They see eye to eye on a lot of things. Certainly, they're both men of faith. I think they both have often felt that they aren't necessarily a part of the DC elite or the Ivy League institution elite. But that relationship is, I think, always a complicated one.
And President Biden repeatedly used the word decency to describe Jimmy Carter's legacy. What do you make of that?
Well, I completely agree. I think most people see Jimmy Carter and see a man who was dedicated to his family, who said that his marriage to Rosalind was his biggest achievement, who was a dedicated Sunday school teacher, who uplifted the lives of those around him, both in his nearby community and around the globe. And it's hard not to see decency in all of those actions. But we also know that President Biden has always really emphasized the importance of decency and goodness and virtue in public servants. That's something that he has aspired to himself. And so it is not surprising that that is something he both really emphasized in Carter's legacy and admired in Carter's legacy.
Tell us a bit more about Jimmy Carter's relationship with his faith and how that was a guiding principle for him.
Well, Jimmy Carter was a Sunday school teacher long before he was president, and he was a Sunday school teacher long after he was president. It was, I think, one of perhaps his most foundational roles, and it was the bedrock of who he was. Because the president is such a difficult position to have. And, I don't think there's any easy time to be a president, but certainly the 1970s were a particularly difficult time. He needed all of the support he could get, and his wife and his family provided that support, but he also leaned on his faith, a sense that he was meant to be there. The role was his to fill, and also that there was a voice that he could speak to or a higher power that he could call on in moments of strife. It also, I think, guided him when he lost and when he had to leave office in recognition that there was a higher purpose and that there was continued good that he could do around the world. And in that, this idea of being a civil servant, of being a servant of God, is one that he espoused regularly, but I think also tried to live, which is an extraordinary thing.
It is. And last year, Jimmy Carter's wife, Rosalind, died. We just heard Biden say he believes they're back together now. The Carters were the longest married first couple in American history. How influential was Rosalind in his life and work, Lindsay?
Well, they were partners in every sense of the word. He was deeply proud of her and of their partnership. It's the reason I think that he always pointed to that first, and that would be the first line that I would include on his obituary. She was also a real partner when whatever they were doing. So she often read notes in the Oval Office. She was with him in the White House. She read briefings. She was very much involved in what he was doing and was a guiding force. She was a partner when it came to the Carter Foundation and the center and all the work they were doing around the globe. When he was building homes, she was often there with him. And so all of the good that he did, she was absolutely a part of, and they cannot be separated, just as I think they didn't want to be in life or in death.
Lindsay Chervinsky, thank you.